Hello, everyone. I am Carol Watts, President of the League of Women Voters of San Jose, Santa Clara, and I want to welcome you all today. And I decided to have a non-league background today so that with water in it, since we've got someone from Save the Bay, wrong bay, but it's still water. So anyway, we have several people coming today that are guests. We have guests who are not members and outside the league, and I'm very happy to welcome you. We are going to hear from Ann Tekverk, a political and community organizer for Save the Bay. Before I introduce her, though, I have an announcement. On Saturday, April 24th at 10 a.m., we're having a very important meeting of members to decide whether we want to change our current position on the structure of local San Jose government. Our study committee members have been working very hard to analyze the issues and gather the facts and the best analysis to present to our members. One of the major issues to discuss is the possible expansion in the authorities of the mayor, for example. We encourage you to register to attend this meeting and read the background material carefully, which has been prepared by the committee. I guarantee that everyone who comes will learn so much more about how our city works today. We want your input. Learn more and sign up from our website, lwvsjsc.org. Today, our Director of Natural Resources, Vicki Alexander, is helping to host this event, and she will be asking the questions that you enter into chat. So if you think of a question during the presentation, don't hesitate to ask. If you prefer to ask the question yourself, you will have that opportunity too. So today, we're so pleased to have Ann Tekverk. She is the political and community organizer for Save the Bay. I'm sure she'll tell you about the important projects of this important organization. She was the grants coordinator of the Rainforest Action Network for 4 years before that. She has an MS in Earth Science from Scripps Institution of Oceanography and a BS in Geology. And she's a certified yoga instructor. We've been talking about that. If you want to know something about yoga, she's the one to talk to. So this is a dynamic woman who knows and cares about our planet. Ann, welcome.
Thank you so much. Excited to see you all. Thanks, Carol and Vicki, for setting this up. I'm thrilled to be here. The League of Women Voters has an amazing reputation because of all the work that you all do to protect our environment, social justice, and so many other issues that women care about. So incredible to be here. And with that, I'm gonna take us through a presentation. And if you have questions, as Carol said, feel free to enter them in the chat, and then I'll try my best to answer all those afterwards. Let's begin. Let me just select my slideshow. All right. So I, of course, am Ann Tekverk, as we've said, and my position at Save the Bay is political and community organizer. So I work to build political and community power in various campaigns throughout the Bay. I know you're all pretty familiar with our work because there's so much coordination between organizations like your own and ours. So I'd love to give you a little bit of history and then jump into our current work to adapt our communities to climate change. Save the Bay's office is, of course, in Oakland, but now that we're all remote, you can find us all over the Bay Area. There's about 25 of us, and we unite Bay Area residents to advocate for a clean and healthy bay, replant wetlands for fish, birds, and marine life, and build Bay smart communities that are strong and resilient for everyone who lives here. Oh, let me just make sure my slides are changing. There we go. Save the Bay, of course, was founded by 3 courageous women in 1961. You can see them in the top left. And we've been mobilizing Bay Area residents like yourselves to keep the Bay alive and restore it to health for decades. You can see an image of our founders here right next to an image from the Army Corps of Engineers. in the 50s, proposing to fill so much of the bay that it would have been transformed into a San Francisco Creek. And the blue is actually where bay fill was proposed. Thankfully, that did not happen, and advocacy for the bay has come a long way since then. Over the years, working with many partners like yourself, Save the Bay has prevented thousands of acres of the bay from being filled in and built upon, won new laws to protect the bay's water and wildlife. We've secured hundreds of miles of shoreline trails and parks for the public to enjoy, and launched restoration of thousands of acres of bay wetlands while mobilizing community volunteers to replant habitat on the shoreline. And you can see some of our volunteers here. Of course, in COVID, it's been a little tricky to bring volunteers out to the bay. Instead, we've had to rely on staff. So it has been a hard year, and our restoration team of 6 has been working immensely hard to keep our wetlands restored and plant native species and sort of maintain what is there in this time. And we hope that by this summer or this fall, we'll get to be back out on the bay with all of you. In addition, we've also led bay voters to create a new tax to restore wetlands, and we've won federal laws to keep more fresh water in the bay for salmon and other fish. We've slashed the amount of trash flowing to the bay, and we and local partners have won bans on plastic bags and styrofoam that I'm sure you're familiar with. Along the way, we've educated so many children and young adults to appreciate the bay and be stewards for the bay for the next generation. Thanks to these efforts, people now realize the bay is a vital part of our quality of life. Even those who don't frequently come into contact with our bay know that it's important. And in fact, it's our #1 economic engine, providing vital tourism, commerce, and access to public recreation. And of course, critical habitat for species. In fact, I wanted to mention, just because I'm sure many of you are aware, just yesterday we received exciting news that Cargill, the company who owns the Redwood City Salt Pond site, has withdrawn their appeal to the EPA, claiming that that area of Baylands is not protected by the Clean Water Act. The EPA had ruled late last year that it is in fact protected. So we're glad to see that lawsuit withdrawn. And it's just another step in realizing a protected, restored bayland at the site. Although we remain vigilant to this threat of bay fill, we know that a growing threat to our bay and our communities now is climate change. I'm sure you all recognize these photos over the last few years. You know, signs of rapidly warming climate have manifested in a way that we can't ignore. Of course, poor air quality, smoky skies, intense heat, wildfires. And in addition to that, we've seen intense flooding during king tide events and dramatic storms. Climate change is also bringing with it the threat of sea level rise, and these larger and more intense storms have been exacerbated by sea level rise. This is a few images of king tide events, which again are naturally occurring, but we see king tide events plus sea level rise means that our communities are experiencing immense flooding, sometimes threatening infrastructure and even people's homes. So as climate change and pollution threaten the bay, our work now is to adapt to climate change that we're experiencing currently, while also mitigating climate change to come, so that we can create cities that are sustainable for future generations. And that is why Save the Bay has our Bay Smart Communities program. This is our policy platform to tackle the threats of climate change. Our current advocacy work emphasizes sustainable urban growth to meet the threats of climate change in our region. So we promote clean water and access to water for everyone, green stormwater infrastructure, which I promise to get more into later, sustainable transportation, and affordable and just housing policies. In all of this, we know that equity is a pillar in development planning. And together we hope to achieve a Bay Smart future where waterways are protected, alternative transportation maximizes community health and minimizes air and water pollution, where urban planning is inclusive and equitable, and where everyone has access to the Bay shoreline and no one is displaced. The threats associated with climate change have to be evaluated at the local level because vulnerability is not homogeneous throughout the region. As an example, you can see here a map of projected flooding from sea level rise in 30 years, combined with one 5-year storm event. And for those of you that don't know, that's just a storm that would be big enough to occur only every 5 years. So that's a measurement tool, but with climate change, we actually see that even more frequently than every 5 years. So in one pretty common storm event, you can see a lot of inundation, not only of our wetlands, but actually of housing and infrastructure. Clearly, our communities are not experiencing this inundation equally. And in fact, low-income communities and communities of color face disproportionate threats from flooding, from urban heat island effect, and from water scarcity. If those of you that might be familiar with Redwood City, for example, you can see the flooding here that impacts housing is actually impacting the mobile home parks along the shoreline, which are one of the only areas in the entire city zoned for affordable housing. So that means that folks there are facing not only housing insecurity and displacement, but also the possibility of losing their home to a flood. The same disproportionate impact can be seen from pollution and contamination in our region, which is primarily concentrated within and adjacent to these same communities. And that's why planning for the future has to consider the impacts of our upstream decisions, those impacts on the bay, its habitat, its wildlife, and all of the folks that live in the bay and on the shoreline. Now more than ever, there's a need for a strong coalition of interests to ensure that smart and equitable development policies are enacted, that agencies and funders coordinate and collaborate to achieve these goals, that climate adaptation plans emphasize natural infrastructure so we can reduce negative impacts on our environment, and also that these infrastructure improvements address climate change and benefit the most vulnerable and underserved residents. Our resilience to sea level rise, more frequent storms, and other impacts from climate change depend heavily on our investment now in urban infrastructure. And as you all know, much of this has been neglected for decades. And so I'd love to jump into an example of our advocacy in San Jose to talk through the kind of infrastructure we want to see all over the Bay. Many of you may be familiar with Climate Smart San Jose. This is just one example of some local cities that have shown great leadership in reducing our region's contribution to the climate problem. Through general plans, so large city plans, and through other documents, we've seen the adoption of many efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and mitigate climate change. San Jose in particular has adopted an ambitious plan called Climate Smart San Jose that makes the city a trailblazer in cutting carbon emissions. At the same time, while plans like these are essential to mitigate the impacts of climate change, many of the effects are already on our doorsteps and aren't going anywhere. As we've moved into this tumultuous future, Save the Bay is advocating for cities like San Jose to go beyond mitigation and immediately implement strategies to adapt to the climate impacts that are here already, like flooding, urban heat, and wildfires. So what does this look like in practice? So a great way to tackle climate adaptation now and set up our cities for the future is investment in green infrastructure. Green infrastructure is a multi-benefit approach that keeps pollution out of the Bay and adapts our cities to climate change. And nature-based solutions like urban greening provide effective and necessary climate adaptation strategies that cities can deploy right now. And I'll show a few real examples of this in a moment, but I wanted to show you this infographic because you can see all the different places where a city could add some greening. Green elements like trees, planter boxes, and other nature-based elements can better manage the impacts of flooding and improve water quality in the Bay because they let stormwater naturally be absorbed and filter through the soil. Replacing sections of concrete with blacktop or concrete and blacktop with urban vegetation. This protects residents from high temperatures and improves air quality. It's one of the ways that we can have a positive impact on urban heat island effect. But bringing back nature into the urban setting isn't only helping us adapt to climate change and improve water quality in the Bay. It also improves quality of life for residents by reimagining public spaces so that we move away from streets that solely function to serve cars. When cars and pedestrians and bikers are separated by things like greenery, protected by bulb outs and other features, we see pedestrian fatalities reduced immensely. In addition, as greenery mitigates urban heat island effect, community members are more likely to take car alternatives like walking or biking, enjoying the straight shade of street trees, and also enjoying those cooler urban temperatures. Meanwhile, these permeable surfaces like planter boxes and rain gardens manage localized flooding and filter water before it flows to the bay. So this approach truly is multi-benefit. It creates habitat, mitigates climate impacts, including not only flooding, but also heat. It protects our pedestrians and bikers, and it provides beautiful green spaces our communities can enjoy. Now, I do want to mention that traditional wetland restoration remains a key strategy in this work. Although we don't always think of wetland restoration as infrastructure per se, these natural sponges absorb huge amounts of water in the soil, mitigating flooding, filtering the water, and providing a gorgeous habitat for animals and spaces for recreation. So wetland restoration is a critical element of climate adaptation that needs to be included in all of our shoreline communities' adaptation planning. Here you can see an example of one of these more inland strategies that can be found throughout the Bay Area. These are rain gardens along Fulton Street in San Francisco. And in the next slide, you can see a green roof on the 4th Street apartments in San Jose, as well as permeable pavement at an intersection in Berkeley on the next slide. There we go. Now, this permeable pavement is not the most ideal form of this permeable infrastructure because in fact it is still pavement. But what I do want to note is, these rain gardens that are also curb bulb outs, they're a great example of protecting pedestrians and taking advantage of the opportunity to create some green in the space. And that could potentially be planted with native species as well, or a particular habitat for an endangered species. Unfortunately, many of these green infrastructure features and stormwater capture projects, they're pilots and they kind of stand alone within cities. Integrating natural infrastructure into development and street design isn't yet business as usual in our Bay Area. So our goal at Save the Bay, and with many organizations like your own, is to accelerate implementation throughout the Bay through local policies and by expanding access to local and state funding as well. I just want to show this slide again because it's so important, all these ways that we can improve our cities, as I talk to you a little bit more about exactly what we've been doing in San Jose. So San Jose, some of you I'm sure are aware, is already in the midst of crafting plans to expand access and safety for cyclists and promote walkable neighborhoods through their Urban Villages program. Urban greening elements like those in this infographic here, they can enhance these plans, making streets safer and more appealing, and at the same time improve the city's climate resilience. The urgency for these complementary approaches has become more apparent this past year as COVID-19 travel restrictions during the height of the summer heat increased awareness among San Jose residents and across the Bay about the need for green walkable neighborhoods. There's no better time than now to be advocating for this. And that's why we've been advocating through the city's prioritization process for San Jose to employ an urban greening implementation plan that would help San Jose achieve multi-benefit infrastructure planning to make the city more resilient to climate hazards and protect its communities in an equitable way. Some of you might be familiar with this prioritization process, but it is a little in the weeds. So for those of you who are not, every year the San Jose Council adopts a roadmap to determine their priorities for the year. This year was a little different. Immense challenges faced every city in the funding space and also in getting their work done because of COVID-19. So the council only adopted 2 new priority initiatives onto this year's roadmap. But as they went through the process, we and many partners were able to educate them all about urban greening and the importance of green infrastructure. We are really encouraged because the council was really favorable to our items. And while an urban greening implementation plan wasn't one of the items that was adopted to the roadmap, our proposal did receive votes from a majority of the council, and it was elevated to what staff are referring to as a priority backlog. That might not sound that exciting, but actually this is a short list of items that are primed to be elevated onto the work plan as staff capacity becomes available to do the work. So we're really excited by this endorsement of an idea that wasn't really on the council's radar until just a few months ago. In addition, with all the conversations we had with council members and the mayor around green infrastructure, we've been able to start conversations with Mayor Liccardo's office to determine whether elements of this effort could be accomplished with the resilience core idea that he's proposing as part of the budget process. And we'd love to stay involved with all of you as this all develops. Ultimately, as you know, there is so much more work to be done, but we are starting to turn the ship toward a greener future. And eventually we hope to achieve a broad and integrated urban greening approach that'll serve as an effective climate adaptation model, not only for San Jose, but also through other cities throughout the Bay Area to promote this vision of equity and climate resilience. And with that, just want to take a moment to thank you all for inviting me to speak with you today and for your support as part of the League of Women Voters to address the threats of climate change and make sure that we have a vibrant Bay for future generations. By advocating for the Bay, restoring wetlands, and educating future generations of Bay stewards, we can achieve a Bay smart community that's equitable, sustainable, and resilient to climate change. And as vaccines roll out and it's safe to gather again, I hope you'll find time to join us on the Bay at one of our restoration sites to do this work on the ground with us. With that, I would love to hear from all of you and talk through some questions. Thank you. And let me just stop my show so you all can see me.
Okay, thank you so much, Mary Ann. This is, as you know, an extremely important topic to members of the League, and we've been working hand in hand often, I think, with your organization to help support this existential issue. Existential is key, I think. So anyway, we're now happy to take questions from everyone in the audience. Vicki will be asking them. If you have more questions as time goes on and want to ask them, you can continue to enter them into chat or simply raise your hand and then we'll call on you and you can ask your own question. You won't be seen, however, when that happens, but you can certainly ask your own question. So Vicki Alexander, our Director of Natural Resources.
Hi, thank you, Mary Ann. We had a few questions come in ahead of time and then questions are popping up on the screen now. One, League was a strong supporter of Measure AA to provide funding to restore San Francisco Bay. Would you give us an update on where we are, how much restoration has taken place, and what challenges or problems are ahead?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. So I would say as a general thing, Save the Bay is very pleased with the progress from Measure AA. I believe, and I don't have these numbers off the top of my head, but I believe 100,000 acres of wetland are restored. And if anyone in the audience knows, because I know many of you are really engaged, and we still have about 100,000 to go. And so immense progress that would not have been possible without the funding provided by Measure AA, but there's still work to be done. I will also say, although this progress is great and there's many key organizations, not just Save the Bay, doing this restoration work. We have so many local and regional partners that also restore Bay wetlands. The Bay estuary is one of the most underfunded estuaries considering its size in America. And so although Measure AA is immensely important and will provide some of the funding that is needed, we are also advocating with partners to get more funding from the federal government for restoration of this estuary. And we're hopeful that in the next 4 years, we'll see some results moving that work forward. Yeah.
Well, related to that is funding. Well, they're talking about green infrastructure, but you're talking about funding for the Bay in general. Is funding for this sort of green infrastructure included in the plan proposed by President Biden?
Yeah, so I know that the city of San Jose staff was advocating for, well, let me start at the beginning. So funding for green infrastructure, you've really hit the nail on the head. It is the big challenge is funding, because we know that a green infrastructure project over the long haul is actually has the highest cost benefit versus repaving roads over and over, and then digging them up again and adding a cistern for water to collect stormwater, and then digging them up again to add a street tree. You know, we know that when these projects are holistic and have these multi benefits, that is the best for a city for the long haul. At the same time, a lot of funding sources at the sources of the state and federal level and at the grant level are very specifically for one purpose. For instance, to clean a particular pollutant out of bay water. And so because of that, the challenge is to have more open-ended funding that recognizes the multi-benefits of a more holistic type of green infrastructure. Oh, I think sounds like my microphone is really, really picking up a lot. So let me back up a little bit. Anyway, so because of this, the funding package from President Biden, actually, the infrastructure package will address some elements of green infrastructure, but I think it'll be up to our local electeds and up to our organizations to support them in this work of advocating for this open-ended funding that is not only addressing mass transit, but also climate change, also urban heat island effect in particular, and flooding in particular. So the answer is sort of yes, but not enough.
Okay. Can you suggest how best to encourage more green infrastructure? You've mentioned funding. Are there also policies or ordinances that are needed?
Absolutely. So some of you may be familiar with general plans and climate adaptation plans, but most people don't even know they exist. Their city's plans for the next 10 to 20 years of infrastructure development. They also have a lot of impact on the city's zoning and some other, really wonky things. But it's really important actually in the city you live in to engage in those processes. And check out what your city is planning to do for climate change, because we have seen some really encouraging work in many different cities, again, to mitigate the impacts of climate change. But we absolutely need more public comments that say, yes, this is great. Let's mitigate climate change for the future. And this neighborhood is flooding now. This neighborhood is way hotter than that one and has way less parks and green spaces. And so I think, like all things, the answer is civic engagement. But the good thing is, it is so important to plan green infrastructure at the local level. And it means that it's a little bit easier to have a voice and build power at the local level. You're not trying to influence the actions of President Biden. You're trying to talk about your city. Your city council members know their communities. They'll be familiar with these areas that need infrastructure investment. So I think it's up to us to, partner up as organizations that have the resources to do this. And every time your city goes into a planning process that involves infrastructure, bring in this argument that what we need now is green infrastructure for all these multi-benefits.
Okay, well, that ties in with this one. I have thanks so much for this excellent presentation. Love the background information, and congrats on great work to move forward greening in San Jose and making it a city priority. Are there other specific ways? I think you're talking about civic engagement. Anything specific or anything else that the league can do to support these efforts?
Yes, absolutely. So, I mean, I know you have an immense history of organizing support in important ballot measures. So when there are ballot measures that include funding like Measure AA, the League of Women Voters, I mean, that's such an endorsement of good ballot measures. People, when they see that, they want to vote that way, at least everyone I know. And so, your voice is so important because you have history, and you have this long history of supporting the right things. And a lot of folks that don't have as much time to invest in this work, they don't necessarily know exactly what an infrastructure bond might entail or something really complicated like that. So endorsements are important, and reaching out to your supporters and educating them. I think, the other thing that we're doing at Save the Bay that the league already does and can do more of is educating our supporters on what exactly is going on in their cities and what things like green infrastructure are and what they mean. Because I'm sure everyone in the Bay has at some point seen a rain garden, but they probably didn't know that, water flows through that rain garden, is filtered out, getting rid of the mercury, the PCBs, and then cleaner, fresher water flows to the Bay, protecting the wildlife in the Bay. And so it's up to us to bring those messages to our supporters so that we have an informed electorate.
Right. Yeah, for sure. Do you have any information on when the plastic bag bans might resume in San Jose or around the Bay?
I do not. And I actually, my deep history is I worked on banning plastic grocery bags in San Diego, one of the linchpin cities in the statewide campaign long ago. And so that work is very close to my heart. And although I understand we all have to take health precautions in COVID, I know that groups are advocating to get bag bans back. And unfortunately, I don't know of a timeline. And I wish that I had one.
Yeah. Do you know anything about the impact of artificial grass instead of regular grass?
I don't know a huge amount about that. It's a very specific area, but I think in general, what is the word? Xeriscaping, or doing landscaping that is low water is really important, because we've been in so many droughts on and off, and that trend toward drought will continue as we have these more intense, even more intense flooding events. Actually, you might think that adds water to our reservoirs, but often we're not capturing that water in the right places because we don't have enough permeable infrastructure. So landscaping your house to need less water is really important for our communities to preserve water. At the same time, I don't know, as far as the materials that are used for these fake lawns, how that impacts the Bay. I imagine they are plastic and therefore can create microplastic problems in some cases. And I'm not sure.
Yeah, that makes sense. One that came in earlier, sometime back, the Baykeeper sued San Jose over pollution going into the Bay. Baykeeper's an ally of Save the Bay. Do you know the status of this issue?
Yeah, great question. So of course, Baykeeper will always have more details, but just a little history for everyone. Baykeeper was in a lawsuit with the city. Baykeeper sued the city in order to basically create an outcome where they had an agreement that the city would spend around $100 million to prevent pollution of creeks from trash, bacteria, and other pollutants. This is something that's required in every city by our regional water board. It's a regional agency that we have that protects the health of our water. And so in order to comply, the city is fixing leaking sewer pipes. In particular, they're installing trash capture devices, which often they're underneath. Like if there's a place that captures water, there's often a screen underneath and water flows through, but particles that are bigger than the screen stay behind, and then those that get cleaned out, that's what a trash capture device is. Baykeeper's also proposing, the city's also proposing to build more green stormwater capture projects, which is what they'll present to Transportation and Environment at the May committee meeting, if anyone is in the weeds on that and really more interested in getting a deeper update.
Okay, thank you. What part do native plants have in your work?
Yeah, absolutely. So I should mention, we've had many great partners in this work in San Jose, and we'll continue to. One thing that's been really helpful for us is speaking in particular with Audubon Society and our city forest and others about the importance of native plants. So when we started this process of advocating for green infrastructure, of course, we knew native plants were important, but those groups have a lot of information on exactly how we can have more native plants in our environments and what species are important. And I think, all green infrastructure is great as long as, you know, the plants are thoughtful from a city planning perspective. But if we can take green infrastructure and include native habitat, that takes it up another level, adding one of those multi-benefits so that we have new bee, butterfly, or bird habitat. So I think including advocacy for native plants within our advocacy for green infrastructure is critical to achieving, you know, a restored and healthy Bay Area. Because it's not just the Bay wetlands, of course, that support our native species. It's also all of the urban forest. And I would also say, you know, there's some interesting data around planting drought tolerant species versus native species in general, although it may cost more sometimes to plant plants that you might have to come back to year after year. It's really important to plant those drought tolerant species, but also to have a whole suite of diverse native species in our urban greening, because that's what'll really get us to having this so-called urban forest, a true habitat for all of the animals we coexist with.
Have you considered educating Parks Commission, Parks Foundation as well, so that in their decision-making process, they could consider using climate smart policies, or maybe you're already working with them?
So in this campaign, I haven't worked with the Parks Commission. Of course, I'm familiar with them, but we have, a part of our work has definitely been, a huge part of our work has been educating those in power, because I think green stormwater infrastructure in particular, this specific piece, has always been put on the sidelines as this thing that is important in order to meet the requirements and to get for every city's water permit. But really, this green infrastructure is a critical approach regardless of the stormwater aspects of the work. And I think, although I haven't spoken to the Parks Commission, I should add it to the list. I do think that taking this information that we've shared to every agency, also the Parks Foundation, yes, to every agency that has power to influence our infrastructure is critically important. And that's actually why you'll see that infographic. One of our fellows who does great digital work created that, because we didn't have one before that. And it's so important to be able to share this information in a simple way. We've been really excited to see that, we've been able to partner with Walk San Jose, and also, what is the Bike Coalition? Blanked for a second. And that is because, again, this work protects our bikers and pedestrians too. So it has so many, such a wide reach of positive impacts. And I think that this education helps get at that, because it helps show a funder or an agency that they might be tackling a bunch of different items within their initiatives. It might not just be, Vision Zero or a particular urban villages. It might be addressing needs and plans across a city or across an organization.
Are we doing enough to also protect health due to impacts of environmental degradation and climate change on poor and disadvantaged? Question is about equity. Are we doing enough?
No. I'm sure you knew the answer to that, but no, but I think it is critical work. And I think that, one thing I didn't mention, but that is really important to know, is that we already have a lot of communities flooding, not only on the shoreline, but localized flooding from these larger storm events. And when a house floods, even if someone does not lose their home, often what happens is mold gets into that home, and it is immensely costly to mitigate that mold, which causes respiratory problems for communities. And we often see in our less advantaged communities this problem of, lower respiratory health. For example, the life expectancy in Atherton versus East Palo Alto, I saw in a great presentation by Yuka once, is 17 years different.
Wow.
And it is because of things like respiratory health. And so our work to mitigate climate change has to be thoughtful and, create resilient cities where everyone in the city is resilient to these impacts, because otherwise we see these huge disparities. And the same is true actually for the more green space you have, especially especially large growth like trees, the better your air quality is too. And when you're separating pedestrians from cars, the air quality in the space that you're walking is better than in the space that you're driving, for example. And so all of these green infrastructure devices, it's critical that they're designed in a way that takes into account air quality and other aspects of community health in order to really achieve an equitable Bay community. And I think that's why, I mentioned really quickly, it is so important that we don't just capture stormwater by putting in permeable pavement, but instead we're designing a community or we're designing infrastructure that serves the whole community, not just one purpose.
Save the Bay recently signed on to a comment letter on Plan Bay Area 2050 implementation plan that talked about sea level rise. Can you talk about the natural infrastructure that you want to see prioritized for spending?
Yeah, absolutely. And I will say, I know we got another question around Plan Bay Area from someone before the presentation. I am not as familiar with our work on Plan Bay Area because my colleague Allison works on that. So I'd love to send you more information after the fact if you like, but I can answer it more generally, which is that we absolutely want to see natural infrastructure prioritized as part of the Plan Bay Area implementation plan. And we would hope that this is, again, not only to mitigate sea level rise, but also to achieve greener, safer, healthier communities. And I think one sort of potential when you have such a big plan like Plan Bay Area is to do a lot of this cross-correlating work that addresses multiple benefits. So, we hope to see not only mitigation of sea level rise, but also a lot of positive impacts for the community through this plan for our future. I also will say that, Plan Bay Area and all regional planning, it has to include extremely thoughtful work on sea level rise, because even if you don't live on the shoreline, our whole Bay Area is a shoreline community. So, the reason we engaged so deeply in that process is we saw that, sea level rise needed to be a bigger consideration in all our planning of where housing should be, but where transit should be, because we can't ignore it. At the end of the day, some homes will flood unless we change the way we plan.
Right. What cities are good examples we can look to as examples of good urban greening?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, there are a lot of cities that have these smaller case study type projects. Berkeley has their downtown project that is really interesting, and they get really good results, and people like living in those pieces of parts of the community. However, we don't yet have a city where we have this holistic, large scale urban greening implementation. And that's part of why we chose San Jose, because we know that they were forward thinking on climate, and they have all these plans that involve elements of this work. And we're really hoping, we also know that staff is on board and sees the benefit of all this work. We're hoping that by getting different plans within San Jose and getting different departments and within San Jose to coordinate, this effort can be more across the board. I will say one really interesting agency to watch is the Flood and Resiliency District in San Mateo County. They are working to tackle specifically flooding issues, so the sea level rise, flooding part of this work more holistically, because sometimes, for example, you'll have a community that's higher in elevation and a community that's lower in elevation. All the flood water goes to that lower community and that's just topography. We have a very interesting regional topography. And so problems like that should be tackled, not just in one city paying for all the impacts, but by the whole county. And so that's kind of the basic idea. And they have some really interesting work coming up. I know right now they're working on the Atherton Canal project to make sure that water flows to the bay again, instead of back into homes and infrastructure. But I expect to see more exciting work across city boundaries from that agency. Also, one more thing, the city of San Mateo is beginning a sustainability scoping process. And I'm blanking on the name of it now, but if you live in San Mateo, definitely check out City of San Mateo's work on sustainability, because they are working to have to basically create green infrastructure for floodwater that also has many other multi-benefits, and that'll be one to watch.
You've talked so often in so many of your answers about how San Jose has many things going on in different departments and pieces, but there's just this real need to coordinate, and that went through the prioritization process. Do you think that's in a good place now, or is there more that needs to be done to make that happen?
I think there's more that needs to be done, and this is not a critique of San Jose as much as it is a truth about all city processes. One of the sort of linchpins we see of realizing overarching plans for urban greening in any city is coordination of, for example, a public works department and a transportation department, because what happens on the streets is determined by both of those departments. And there's so many other departments involved in the work in a city, but this is just an example. And I think in every city, what we see, it kind of starts at the funder and then ends at the city. We see these very specific initiatives that sit with a certain staff member or a certain department. And if those initiatives, for example, to have clean stormwater flowing to the bay, so to capture it, filter it before it gets to the bay, or combined with overland transportation, a bike plan that is also going to have to change and dig up the street to make it safer for bikers, then you can create a situation where you've made the street safer for bikers, greened it, and the greening that you created that separates cars and bikes also filters the water to the bay. And I think, I've worked a lot in Oakland on stormwater as well, but in every city we see that, because funding is for such specific projects, because city budgets are so specific, and advocacy for those can be quite fierce because every city needs more money. That's just, it's just how it goes. I think we have a lot more work to do in helping cities to work across departments, in doing the work ourselves to look across departments and see what all of their plans are and all their goals are, and then coming to them with ways that they are able to achieve results, and when they do, celebrating those results. Because I think a lot of times, cities know that they need to meet certain goals to meet certain funders and certain constituencies, and often pushing for that flexibility is difficult because they've made certain promises and they need to meet them. That was a long answer, sorry.
Okay. I'm not sure if you can hear me. I had looked like I had an unstable internet. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, good.
I can, yeah.
San Jose will be heavily impacted by sea level rise. Should we focus on specific actions to mitigate? Is enough now being done by the city from your perspective?
We should definitely focus on specific actions to mitigate this. I think, it's important to recognize that every infrastructure project is an opportunity, but that's not to say that every restoration project should have a bike lane. I think it's important to have like planning across the scope of the city to realize where projects can have the most impact and where the most work is needed. And I think, I don't think the city has the planning or the resources to magically end flooding in San Jose. I don't think anyone thinks that right now. However, I know that the city is advocating for more flexibility in funding through through state and federal processes, which is great. And we've been in communication about that. And I also think that we'll have to continue to bring these green infrastructure possibilities and to continue to watch progress in San Jose, because often everyone understands that we need to mitigate climate change, but often I think we lose the adaptation piece of the conversation, the fact that climate change is here now, because it is the harder problem to tackle. It's easy to reduce emissions in the sense that there is a how-to. It doesn't mean you can magically convince everyone to do those things to reduce emissions. but the techniques are quite straightforward. Whereas to mitigate flooding, even if it is flooding from sea level rise where the water table is, that flooding still might be inland. You're also dealing with the climate impact of larger storm events on top of king tides, on top of sea level rise. And so I think that we need to use, really good modeling as well as community engagement to find exactly where these projects to mitigate sea level rise should occur. And I'll say also continue to restore and protect our wetlands, because every acre of wetlands absorbs so much water and is a huge piece in protecting us from sea level rise and our native species as well.
You just mentioned state and federal funding, and there's a question: is Save the Bay working with other organizations at state and federal level to increase flexibility in funding? And it looks like she meant flexibility in funding for transportation, which can be rigid.
Yeah, absolutely. So as I mentioned, I spoke with basically the woman who's in charge of coordinating funding for San Jose for the city. And we've been in touch, about advocating for more flexible state and federal funding. And I know that they sent a letter to the Biden administration requesting this. But I think it's the beginning of our work in that area, and a lot more work needs to be done by us and by cities. And I hope that we and you all and many other organizations will be a partner in that work, because I do think there's an education piece and an advocacy piece to that work. And I think it's a lot easier to, sell a train line to your supporters. It's like much easier to understand how that might have an impact and what it does than a holistic plan for urban greening. And I think that's the education piece that we needed to take to those that are in power.
There have been a couple of questions that came in before the presentation about describing steps individuals can make to support climate change mitigation or to help with this in general. And I know you've mentioned, some advocacy and some education. Anything else you'd like to add about that?
Absolutely, yeah. So I think Save the Bay has a very three-pronged approach, and it kind of applies to individuals, what we can do as well. As I mentioned, there's education of your supporters, but as an individual, education of the folks around you, especially because your friends, they respect you, they listen to you, so they might not know about this and you do, and you can help sway them to understand how to vote, or how to advocate for their community. So education is always important. And then there's engagement in these larger processes. Civic engagement, again, at the local level, is really important. And voting as well, of course. You all know that, it's in the name. But I also think there are personal things that we can do, and that's always an area that feels a little bit like separate, because it's only the actions of one person. At the same time, going out and working to restore the wetlands, it's critical to the work that we do at Save the Bay, and critical to many restoration organizations. And you get to be out on the bay experiencing what makes it so special. And so I think, every step we take to restore the bay is helping to mitigate climate change as well. And in addition, as far as your, personal actions, like I mentioned, vote and educating friends, you can also, you can create low water landscapes in your yard. Within your neighborhood, if you have a neighborhood association that's planning a walk or a bike path, you can, ask for native species to be a part of that, or ask for it to be more green than the original proposal. And so I think all of this is, all of these individual actions, they might feel really small, but it's so important to be engaged in your small little community of your, the few houses on your block, and know how that's going to impact your city. And I think we can all have an impact there, because yeah, it's our community and we are their voice.
Okay, thank you. I was trying to see if there were more questions here. and I managed to minimize my screen. Virginia started asking a question, I think, but I'm not seeing the rest of it.
Yes, Virginia, I can read it too. I just mentioned that, many rivers and streams flow into the bay, and
Okay.
upstream mitigation absorbs these pollutants. So, this relates back to the Baykeeper lawsuit, and many other organizations work to realize green stormwater infrastructure in particular. The motivation for that work is to prevent pollution from traveling from creeks all the way to the bay, including trash, bacteria, pollutants like mercury, pharmaceuticals, and a plot of soil will actually absorb, and then the biota that lives in it will detoxify a lot of different bacteria, making it much safer before that water flows to the bay. And so we see that it's so important not only to restore the bay wetlands, but make sure that your storm drain is actually clear of trash, so that water doesn't flow elsewhere but flows through the proper channels, and maintaining all the infrastructure that we don't think about and don't see in our local neighborhoods that allows water to flow through trash capture devices, through soil, through permeable surfaces before it enters the bay.
And I think you said Save the Bay, and I know other organizations too do have actual hands-on restoration projects, but not during COVID, but maybe coming back later this year.
Yeah, and I don't know the details. Well, the truth is, I don't believe we have a timeline yet, because we want to make sure everyone has access to vaccines before we're even having this conversation. But our restoration program will be back in some form. And in the meantime, we have been working out on the bay ourselves in a safe, careful way. But it'll be critical once we're able to all do it safely to get back into that work on the bay, because our volunteers really make our organization. You cannot restore a large wetland space with a couple of people. And so I'm sure many of you have been out to those programs. And I would say also, in the meantime, while we don't have our programs, I encourage you to go out on the bay in all the ways you can. And we have information on our website, of course, around great bay trails and opportunities to safely be out on the bay.
Great, thank you. I think we're right at the end of our program. Carol?
Yes, thank you so much, Marianne and Vicki, in asking all those questions. You had a great presentation, and we really appreciate all of your work and your ideas to improve greening in our communities, which are going to help us all live much better. I also wanted to say that our next Lunch with League is going to be Thursday, May the 20th. And we're going to hear from Josh Barus and Ramona Givargas, I don't know if I pronounced those correctly, who are the co-founders of San Jose Spotlight news service. And I'm really looking forward to hearing them talk about the role of local journalism in strengthening our democracy. If you haven't noticed this newsletter before, you can subscribe to it and find out. It's my go-to place for finding out what's happening locally. So thanks again to everyone for joining us today. And everyone stay safe, and we look forward to when we can meet in person again.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.